Welcome to the Nantucket Game. Today we are continuing our exploration of the American Revolution on Nantucket. For those of you who didn't catch it, we suggest listening to part 1 of this episode. Adam and I are joined now by our first ever repeat customer, Nathaniel Philbrick. Welcome back to the Nantucket Game.
It's great to be here.
Thank you.
Again.
In your career, you've published successful books on a wide variety of topics. Your real breakout book was In the Heart of the Sea about the Essex, which we covered last year on this podcast, but you have been a Pulitzer Prize finalist for your book about the Mayflower. You have covered Custer's Last Stand. You, of course, have written about Nantucket. And you even have an upcoming book about the gold rush coming out this fall. But as far as I can tell, the topic you've covered the most is actually the American Revolution. So what drew you and what continues to draw you to the American Revolution?
It began kind of by accident. I didn't intend to write 3 books and then a travelogue about Washington and his first presidency. I began by wanting to write a book about Boston and the Revolution. When I was growing up, Johnny Tremaine by Esther Forbes was one of my favorite books in middle school. And I always kind of wanted to know what it would have been like to live in Boston at the time of Johnny Tremaine. And, all of my books are in one way or another about groups of people, whether they be the crew of the Essex or the 102 pilgrims on the Mayflower, groups of people experiencing a crisis under enormous stress and what leadership happens along with that. And so it was around 2010 when I began to think about Boston in the American Revolution. And what drew me to it was that Boston in the Revolution was basically an island. It bore no resemblance to what it is today. It was an island with 3 hills of almost mountainous proportions connected by a thin neck of land to Roxbury, and it had 15,000 people. And at that time, Nantucket had 15,000 year-round people. And I knew what it was like to live on an island of that size. You didn't necessarily know everyone, but you recognized them in the grocery store. Life is intimate when you're dealing with a group that size. And I thought, well, I live on Nantucket. I'd like to find out what happened to Boston when it was that size, with the tremendous pressures of a revolution descending upon it. And so that led me to writing that book. And then George Washington appeared after the book's climax, the Battle of Bunker Hill, and I became fascinated. This was not the George Washington, that we see on the $1 bill. He was in his early 40s. His hair was still reddish brown. He wasn't the staid conservative general he would become. He was aggressive, fiery. He wanted to attack the British and end this damn war as quickly as possible. Then I had to know what happened to him once he became president, and that led my wife Melissa and our dog Dora on a journey to follow Washington's trips that he took during the first 2 years of his presidency around the 13 states to spread the word of the new country, and here I am, your president. And, this is before mass media. So he decided he had to go out there and do it personally. And so I've spent 13 years of my life writing about this topic in one way or another. And it's been an important part of my growth as a historian, I think.
I think one of the things that I really appreciate about your literature is that you often cover topics steeped and blanketed in myth that is so enveloped with what we think is history, and you pull back the layers of it and you show a side to it that feels very personal. Mm-hmm. I think a lot of the individuals within the American Revolution have such this persona around them that maybe the true reputation that they have is not necessarily the one that they had in their own lifetime. One of the things about your books, whether it's about the revolution or otherwise, is you make those decisions relatable and understandable. And these are decisions that really foundationally set the stage for America as a nation.
Yeah, the period of the American Revolution was profoundly creative. I mean,
surprisingly creative, I found.
Yeah, I mean, it's kind of like the Beatles in Liverpool, or where something new is being created, something new, dynamic. And this is a new country with a new democratic republic. That didn't exist at that point. And they were leading with their ideals. That didn't necessarily mean that the ideals were fulfilled, but that's part of the interest of the story. But, I just found it just as you said, we have this mythic sense of the beginning of America, where it began with militiamen from New England, and then it's almost like each battle is a stepping stone to the God-ordained independence won at Yorktown. And it wasn't that way at all. The revolution had starts and stops. It had a traitor in the middle of it, one of our country's best generals at the beginning of the revolution.
Take out Benedict Arnold?
Benedict Arnold.
Yeah.
And, Washington admired him greatly and relied on him greatly, and for good reason. It's not just mythic characters, like the Trojan War or something like that. These are people with failings, with strengths, interacting with one another under terribly arduous circumstances. And the thing of it is, we look at it and we say, oh yeah, it was going to work out just great. They didn't know that. This could have ended at any moment with all of them being hanged in London. And it didn't work out that way, of course. So what I'm trying to do in my books is to create that sense of history as lived, not as the foregone conclusion that we often regard it as, because that's not how life is. We don't know where we're going. We're confused, we're desperate, we're grasping in some respects, we're altruistic sometimes, very few times, but that's what I'm trying to capture in my books. And I really felt the Revolution provided a great way to do that. And what I also liked about it was, with Bunker Hill, it begins in New England. With Valiant Ambition, the stage moves to the Middle Atlantic. And then finally, with Yorktown, it moves to the South. And so for me, I love the research trips associated with each book. And so it was so fun, tracing the roots of some of these battles and things like that, but visiting various parts of the country as part of it. And so for me, it's been a chance to really get to know what happened in the beginning.
I think when I started out on the research process for this episode about the American Revolution, I really hold the American Revolution in very high esteem. I think it is one of probably the most important moments in time in human history. I think that it does set the stage for this new form of government. I think that the ideals that were fought for, we can argue how much those were upheld, but that were fought for and that were at the base of this conflict, really set the stage for the modern world we live in and define just and unjust in our vernacular today.
Yes. It created an aspirational society, and, that all people will be created equal, and it gets redefined with each generation, and we're never going to achieve it because we are flawed human beings.
And an imperfect union.
Yes, exactly.
In the founding documents, they call us an imperfect, and I love that.
Yeah, no, we're always trying to do it. And, you can beat up George Washington and the founding fathers for all sorts of failings. But I also think you have to respect what they were trying to achieve, because what they were trying to achieve was better than all of them.
I actually think there's something almost profoundly comforting about the human aspect that comes through in your writings and also in the research that we did for this episode. It's like, these aren't people who are preordained to do something, who have abilities beyond the rest of us. They're struggling the same way. They're running into the same sorts of conflicts that we can kind of understand. And so it does make you think that, that could be any American in the same position trying to make those choices that lead to revolution.
I've had people say, how dare you write about these people from the past in any kind of anything other than putting them in a perfect light. And, that's wrong. These were ordinary people in extraordinary situations, and they did extraordinary things, but they were people when it began. They were people like you and I. And, you're not being fair to the people of the past, and you're not being fair to the people of the present if you believe they were different, essentially, than us. Yes, they lived in a different time. They had different value systems in many regards and upbringings and all of that. but they were still flawed human beings. And as you said, I think that makes the past more approachable and realistic, and also ultimately more inspiring because, look what they started. I was speaking in Berlin, Germany years ago, and, the woman who was taking us around was saying, we look to you as, the longest lasting democracy. And for me, it was like, whoa, I sort of take it for granted as an American. And I think, lately, no one is taking anything for granted. But, that it's pretty amazing that they pulled it off as imperfect a way as they did. They did something remarkable.
Well, to bring it back to Nantucket, when I was digging into the archives for this episode, I really wanted to find these great patriotic voices and these Nantucketers who fought for these just and lofty goals that we just described, but I was stumped.
No, we were... Nantucketers don't like to go into this, really, because Nantucket was the exception that kind of proves the world. I mean, the last thing Nantucketers wanted was a revolution. There was nothing wrong with the way things existed from their standpoint. While the rest of Massachusetts was suffering from the series of punitive legislative acts from Great Britain.
The Townsend Acts.
Yes, tea tax, they shut down the port and the port bill. I mean, it was awful. Nantucket is experiencing this unprecedented economic boom because it is, it's the whaling capital of the world. Before there was petroleum, when the streets of London were lit by Nantucket whale oil, the machines being invented in the Industrial Revolution were lubricated by it. And Nantucket was basically the sole source. And so Nantucketers were doing great, and England was their primary market. And the last thing they wanted to do was to, eliminate that market. And Samuel Adams and John Hancock in Boston or Nantucketers saying, oh man, we don't, this is, so Nantucket was viewed from the beginning as basically a loyalist conclave, and it was really. There were Nantucketers, particularly Quaker Nantucketers, who claimed, but no, it's not a question of that. It's our spiritual beliefs. We don't believe in, armed conflict. But, the fact of the matter is when it came in the years preceding the revolution, Nantucketers had been some of the most aggressive business people the world had known up until then. I mean, they're kind of the archetypes of, what we're seeing in all the soap operas, financial soap operas that are streaming today. Nantucketers were like that. Especially the Quaker Nantucketers were that way, the Roach family.
Who owned those two ships in the Boston Tea Party.
Owned those two ships, and, they would give no one any quarter, and they created a lot of enemies in Boston, particularly none other than John Hancock. Hancock, prior to the Revolution, had decided, he inherited all this money from a relative who had profited during the 7 Years' War. He was a war profiteer. And so he had all this money, and now there wasn't a war. Well, what do you do? He said, well, it's clear where the money is in the whaling industry. And so he tried to create a whaling monopoly to outdo the Nantucketers and buy up the whole market. And the Nantucketers foiled him. And this, he did not like Nantucketers, and I am sure this contributed to the fact, what happened to the tea in Boston. And so, Nantucket, we can't look to Nantucket for examples of the revolutionary fervor, or the great patriot. They just don't exist. And the other thing that Nantucketers had to worry about, they lived on an island with 30 miles out to sea. Their population had grown to the point that they couldn't feed themselves. So they were reliant on food and supplies coming from elsewhere. And their fleet of ships, the British Navy could just do with them what they wanted. And so Nantucket knew its back was against the sea, if not a wall. They wanted no part of the revolution. And so they pleaded to stay neutral. But, it's impossible to stay neutral in something like the American Revolution. And so, they got it from both sides, and it was a very tough time for the island.
It's one of the things that we talked about, Adam and I, that the writing during the revolution on Nantucket, the suffering is so evident.
Yeah.
The lack of fuel, the lack of food. I looked at Martha's Vineyard a little bit to see how it compared, but the size of the island and the population, they were able to sustain themselves with more farming than we were out here. And the amount of smuggling was also fascinating.
Yeah. Yeah.
That got Nantucketers in even more trouble with the mainlanders. But
Oh, yeah. I mean, it was, well, you know what? Nantucketers were kind of suffering from the fact that, they had put everything into whaling. They had not created any kind of agriculture of any note given their population. Like you said, the vineyard was primarily agricultural, and, they participated in the whaling industry, but largely through Nantucket. And so when all this hit, I mean, they were eating seagulls. They were eating rats. There was no wood, because they had cut down just about every tree on Nantucket. And so they started digging peat in the bogs. And in fact, you can still see today where they, dug out these bogs. And they were desperate. And then it really built to a climax in 1780 when Nantucket experienced what was called the hard winter of 1780, where it was so cold, the island was surrounded by ice as far as the eye could see. And they were cut off from everything. And there's the tradition that one Nantucketer said to the other, "I need a hammer. I really need a hammer." And his friend says, "Why do you need a hammer?" "So I can bang out my front teeth because I can't. There's nothing to eat. There's no use for this."
I think one of the greatest ironies that I found in the Revolution, especially at the beginning, is at the very start, it's really a Boston versus England conflict. That it is the Bostonians who are upset, the military comes in, and the sparks flash, and you get the shot around the world, the Battle of Lexington and Concord. But soon after, those Bostonians are able to convince people across the colonies to join the conflict. And they're convincing farmers in Virginia, it's almost a completely different country down there, to join the conflict. And yet they can't convince other merchants in Massachusetts here on Nantucket to join them in the same way.
Right. Well, because just about every other colony, let's call Nantucket at this point its own colony, because it really was. That's how they considered themselves. But everyone had a beef with England. For example, George Washington and Thomas Jefferson, the Virginia planters, were all in huge debt to the merchants that they worked with in London. And, this angered them. They also had ambitions to the west. They wanted to, buy those lands. That's how America would, fuel its rise, was to move west and confiscate the land from the native peoples. And they wanted to do that. And Britain had said, no, we're going to control that. You can't do that. And that really angered someone like George Washington, who managed to translate a lot of what the British government owed him for his services during the 7 Years' War into land grants. And if this went through, all those lands would potentially be worthless to him. And so people like that were, okay, yeah. And, George Washington, he had wanted nothing more than during the 7 Years' War than to become an officer in the British Army, but they never granted him that. And that was a big mistake in the long run. They had gripes. And so, that contributed to their willingness to join the Massachusetts bandwagon. Nantucket didn't have that. I think since time immemorial on Nantucket, a bad idea has been known as a Boston notion. and that may have started with the Revolution, where, they just said, no, what are you doing? And they had a point. American colonists at this time were the freest, least taxed people in the Western world. They had it better than anyone anywhere else. And then here they were going crazy over, a few shillings or whatever for tea, and which was actually being sold to them cheaper than it had been before, which, is the ultimate. For, the rest of Americans, not Nantucketers, they didn't want to be beholden to the mother country. For example, Puritans, had come to the New World because their ancestors had been persecuted for their religious beliefs in England. Why the heck were they going to be beholden to the country that had basically cast out their ancestors who built the fabled city on a hill in Boston? This rankled. This kind of thing contributed to the fact that they were willing to push this disagreement with King George and the Parliament to the point of revolution. But Nantucket, they didn't feel it that way. And adding to it was Nantucket was founded by people who had been persecuted by the Puritans. For many for their Quaker beliefs, for their if they hadn't been Quakers, they had been sympathetic to the Quakers. And the Puritans, they hanged a bunch of Quakers on Boston Common. And so, this contributed to their sense of, what the heck? Why do we owe you guys anything? You didn't help us when we needed you at the beginning. And the other thing to remember is they had created the whaling industry, the first global economic force in America. I mean, it was the envy of the world. And as you see the run-up to the Revolution, Benjamin Franklin, whose cousin's here on Nantucket, his mother had been a Nantucket Folger, he talks to Edmund Burke about the Nantucket whale fishery. And both Burke and ultimately Thomas Jefferson will write about how the Nantucketers have created this economic force that is so powerful. And what Burke argues is you don't want to push these guys into a rebellion because you're going to be losing this kind of example of just what Britain should be doing. And of course, it would go that way. And so Nantucketers felt left out in the cold. And so it was not a fun time on the island.
But economic power that Nantucket wielded, it did also benefit them at times. There was the Restraining Act, 1775, in which England said you cannot trade with non-English ports, but Edmund Burke amongst them actually granted Nantucket an exemption from that, and which only you can imagine angered the people on the verge of revolution already.
Oh, can you imagine? I mean, okay, so we're cut off and not Nantucket? I mean, it was actually kind of short-sighted because, everyone was hoping that it was all going to stop, and go away. So Nantucket gets this exemption, but they're basically declaring their loyalty to England with that. And so that put an absolute target on their backs as far as the rest of New England and the colonies were concerned. And things would cascade, and it would get really tough. I mean, it created huge tensions and disruptions.
It's almost like because of the perceptions of Nantucket from either side, that when the conflict kicks off, everybody on the island is forced to, make either an economic decision or a personal decision about which way they're going to lean, because neither side really takes ownership of Nantucket, and both sides kind of repudiate Nantucket in some ways.
Yeah, I mean, it's kind of like Switzerland, but they didn't have the banks that enabled them to, keep Hitler from attacking them or the Allies. It's hard to get all revved up about, I'm going to be a neutral. You're not fighting for a cause, and it was a very complicated time. And before the Revolution, a French-American farmer named Saint-Jean de Crèvecoeur, who would write this wonderful book. I think it's the best book from the 18th century, Letters from an American Farmer. And he spent a lot of time on Nantucket. He would write about the economic miracle that occurred on Nantucket, that, out of this barren sandbank, they created a fortune out of whale oil. And Crèvecoeur, by the way, would be devastated by the American Revolution. From his point of view, the colonies were this paradise, so much better than his native France, where you had, the king and the peasantry and, all of this stuff. If you came to America, it didn't make any difference where you came from or who you are, you had a chance to make it. And the revolution breaks out, and he goes, well, just like Nantucket, what's going on? Why are you doing this? And he would end up having his property confiscated by the Patriots, and in desperation fleeing back to France with his son, and write this book, Letters from an American Farmer, that would be published during the Revolution. And the British loved it because it was an example of, look at the idiocy of this revolution. Look what they've destroyed, this paradise that it once was. And Crevecoeur's book ends, with him coming out to Sconset and watching the ocean waves rolling in this terrifying force. And, it comes to symbolize the chaos that the war has brought upon the colonies. And this was not a fun time on this island. You don't have, it wasn't the scene of any heroic battles. They were getting attacked by British and Patriots, what were known as shaving mills. Fast American vessels would come into the harbor and confiscate things. There were something like 100 whaleboats taken for the American cause in Lake Champlain from Nantucket. And so it was definitely a time that did not typify what was happening in the rest of America.
So what ultimately was the impact of the revolution on Nantucket and its trajectory? Something like 85% of the fleet on Nantucket was decimated or seized during the conflict. So what happened to this island after the war concluded?
Yeah, well, and what was really tough is that initially, the war ends, fine. Britain says, great, we won't buy American whale oil. And so, okay, now what do we do? Well, for one thing, the Roach family was also despised by many Nantucketers by this time. And what do? Well, they go to New Bedford. They found New Bedford, which is, as we all know, is a mere satellite of Nantucket. But ultimately, it would take the whaling football and run with it. And, so in one sense, Nantucketers created their own downfall. And then there are other former loyalists who say, okay, so we can't, our whale oil isn't going to London, but we can found whaling communities in France and in Wales. And, it's not easy, it's difficult, but there are, towns in Milford Haven, Wales, that were built by Quakers that have that unmistakable look. And then there were other Nantucketers who were, so shaken by the vulnerability of Nantucket. They said, okay, we need to create a whaling community that, will not be ravaged by the next war. So these people went way, way up the Hudson River and founded Hudson, New York, which for a time in the early 19th century was rivaled Nantucket. They had to go way up the Hudson River, but so what? At least they could build their houses and create a community that the British were not going to be able to attack at will. And so, and gradually things began to kick into gear, markets opened up, and Nantucketers, proceeded where they had been before. But in a sense, it really would never be the close, tightly knit whaling community it had been before the Revolution. I mean, the Revolution really kind of destroyed that wonderful Quaker conclave of whaling that Nantucket had been. It was different after that. But what's an interesting sort of revolution redux is the War of 1812, where what did the Nantucketers do in the War of 1812? Well, they make a deal with the British admiral, for neutrality. Mm-hmm. And once again, that really angers the country that is to their north. And it's funny, when Ralph Waldo Emerson visited Nantucket in 1847 to dedicate the new Athenaeum, which was just opening, the first public building to go up after the Great Fire. He would write in his notebook, "Nation of Nantucket," which makes its own war and peace. And that's not only a reference to what happened in the War of 1812, but also to the sense of pride and we do whatever the hell we want. That was part of Nantucket. That arrogance, really, and and that was very true. But it's fine to be arrogant when things are going well, but it comes back to haunt you when they aren't.
I feel like it almost sounds like you can use the war as a before and after of different eras of Nantucket's whaling history. Mm-hmm. It's never truly the same. You're saying that all these folks, they made decisions that irrevocably broke them as a community. And I guess I'm wondering, does that play out in the same way throughout other towns, other places in America, or is that really unique to Nantucket, where you have such fracturing around the Revolution?
Yeah, it's a very good question, and it wasn't unique to Nantucket, particularly in certain areas of the country. For example, on Long Island, and it's kind of related to Nantucket because whaleboats were involved. I mean, what happened was the British occupied Long Island and New York. And yet Washington had a spy network in Long Island, and there would be raids on Long Island by patriots in whaleboats. They were known as the Whaleboat Wars. And they'd sail over from, let's say, New Haven, attack the coast of Long Island at night and raid them, And it was ugly. And often these were former neighbors in towns in Long Island, who had left because of the British occupation, coming back and settling personal scores. It was, it was just a dirty civil war. But it was really in the South where it became this cat and dog struggle between loyalists and patriots, where, people were burning neighbors' houses, and, it was awful. It's not the greatest movie, but Mel Gibson's The Patriot is really about all of that. And this is where, I think it's unappreciated that the American Revolution had its goals and all that, but what was going on during it was very much an ugly civil war that I think you can say really anticipates what's going to happen, 75 years later with the American Civil War. I mean, where there's divisions within this country. This country was divided even during the Revolution, after the Revolution, and clearly preceding the Civil War. And it's never been a place of absolute unity and agreement. But that's kind of what a democratic experiment is all about. This is what a republic is. We, our Nantucket town meeting, we go in with often very different views, argue it out, and somehow reach a decision. And it's not always pretty. And it really wasn't pretty during the American Revolution.
I think what you've done so beautifully in this conversation, like I said at the beginning of this episode, you pull back the layers of the myth and show the human stories that are uncovered. So thank you so much for joining us on the Nantucket Gam again.
Well, thank you. It's great to be back again, and it's you guys do a great job, and what you do in terms of raising Nantucket's historic profile is to be commended. So thank you. It's an honor to be on your podcast.
I think we should say as well, when should people look out for the new book?
Yes. Okay. On October 6th, what is called The Rush, California Gold, the Civil War, and the Making of the Modern World comes out. And particularly in the beginning, Nantucket features large. And it's how I first became really acquainted with the California Gold Rush. And because, by the time of the Great Fire in 1846, whaling had declined to the point where Nantucketers were looking for another act. And the discovery of gold was it. And they got into their whale ships, packed them full of prospectors to be, sailed around Cape Horn, and literally abandoned the ships inside the Golden Gate. And there on hangs a tale that I tell in the rush.
We'll look forward to it.
Oh, thank you. This has been a lot of fun.
Awesome. For more information, head to NHA.org or check us out on social media. This episode was developed and created by Thomas Parrish, Adam DeLogue, and Phoebe Botticelli-Pole. Special thanks to our Chief Curator, Michael R. Harrison, and our Director of Collections and Research Services, Amelia Holmes. Our theme music was composed and performed by Isaiah Williams. Other music in this episode is by Blue Dot Sessions. The Nantucket GAM is a production of the Nantucket Historical Association. This episode is supported by NHA members and listeners like you. Thank you.